This tour de force of 20th century concrete architecture is called Baynard House, and it sits between the River Thames and Queen Victoria Street in the centre of London. It was constructed for British Telecom and is still used as an office by them, and was completed in 1979, just as the fashion for such brutalist monstrosities was beginning to wane. When work on the construction of this building began in the mid-1970s, underneath were found the archaeological remains of a much more opulent and splendid building, a mansion called Baynard's Castle, a Tudor royal palace on the riverfront. And before her exile from court in late 1531, Baynard's Castle was the official residence of Queen Catherine of Aragon, the much maligned first wife of King Henry VIII. And in this video I want to explore what little we know about the history of this long-lost royal palace, its design and its architecture, who built it and lived there, and how it came to be Queen Catherine's residence. As we begin to trace the story of this long-lost palace, we must first go back to the late 11th century. The Norman city of London developed within the patched-up Roman walls of Londinium. And sometime between 1070 and 1090, land in the southwestern quadrant of the city between the river and the city walls was given by William the Conqueror to a man called Ralph Baynard, who had come to England with him at the time of the Norman conquest. And Baynard built on the site overlooking the river a small fortification, which became known in subsequent centuries as Baynard's Castle. Recent archaeological investigations suggest that Baynard's Castle was in this spot here. At Baynard's death, the property and this sparkling new castle was inherited by his son Geoffrey. However, although their name would be forever associated with this spot, the Baynards didn't retain the property for long, for Geoffrey's son William had all his property, including the castle, confiscated by King Henry I, for having the effrontery to support the claim to the throne of Henry's elder brother Robert Curthose. In 1106, the castle and the land around it was briefly granted to Eustace, Count of Boulogne, before being granted in the 1130s to a man called Robert Fitzrichard. Fitzrichard was a loyal supporter of King Henry I and served as the steward in his household, and at the same time he was given the land here in London, he was also given lands in Essex and was made a feudal baron. Baynard's Castle eventually passed to Robert's son Walter Fitzrobert, and then in 1198 to his son Robert Fitzwalter. Now, Robert Fitzwalter was among the most prominent barons of his time, and he was at the forefront of opposition to King John. He was at the centre of a conspiracy against the king in 1212, and he was one of the barons who gave surety to Magna Carta in 1215, and he was an opponent of John in the Barons' War that then followed. Despite all of that, Fitzwalter managed to survive, dying in 1235, 19 years after King John. However, Baynard's Castle did not survive his rebellion, and in 1213, while Fitzwalter was exiled on the continent, King John confiscated the land and flattened the Norman castle. Fitzwalter was given permission later to rebuild it, but it isn't clear if he bothered to do so. The area that surrounded the castle within the City of London was known as the Soak of Castle Baynard, and was more or less coterminous with the parish of St Andrew by the Wardrobe, and it would remain in the Fitzwalter family's hands for another 200 years. All except for the western part of the property, including the site of the Norman castle, which was sold in 1275 by Robert Fitzwalter, the first Baron Fitzwalter, and he sold it to Robert Kildwaby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Kildwaby was a Dominican friar, and he gave the site he'd purchased to his order for the establishment of a new priory. And the site, including any above-ground remains of the old castle, were levelled, and the Blackfriars, as they were known, constructed their priory church and monastic buildings right on top of it, buildings that would survive until the dissolution of the monasteries. At much the same time as the Blackfriars was established on the site of Baynard's Castle, great nobles were beginning to establish London townhouses for themselves. These were generally known as hospices, places where they could live in some comfort when in London on matters of state. And part of the soak of Castle Baynard, right on the riverfront and next to St Paul's Wharf, a succession of houses of this sort were then built for the nobility. In the early 15th century there was a hospice on this site called Le Old Inn, and it was owned by Edward II, Duke of York, a grandson of Edward III. Its name suggests that the structure was of considerable age when York acquired it. How this part of the soak of Castle Baynard passed from Fitzwalter's hands to the Duke of York is not precisely clear. York was married to Philippa Mohun, the widow of Walter Fitzwalter, the third Baron Fitzwalter, and perhaps the property came to her as part of her jointure, or maybe York purchased it from her son, the fourth Baron. In the 1420s, this same house was then in the hands of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the son of Henry IV, and he rebuilt it after a fire in 1428. It is likely that this new house of 1428 was much more impressive and perhaps even defensible, and around this time the Old Inn began to be known as Baynard's Castle, despite not being on the site of the original castle. In 1447, this house appears to have then been forfeited to the crown, and in 1453 it was granted by King Henry VI to his half-brother Edmund Tudor, the father of the future King Henry VII. Edmund Tudor died in 1456, and by 1457 the house was back in the hands of the House of York, and it was the residence of Henry VI's great rival, Richard III, Duke of York, the nephew of the second Duke. When Richard's son, Edward, became Edward IV in 1461, the property then became part of the Crown estate, and it was put at the disposal of the King's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. It was in the courtyard of Baynard's Castle that on June the 26th, 1483, the crown was offered to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and he became King Richard III. Don't take this depiction of that event by Sigismund Goetz as an indication of the architecture of the structure at the time. The castle, as Richard III knew it, primarily built by Duke Humphrey, would not last long. John Stowe, the London chronicler, tells us that in 1501, King Henry VII had the structure almost wholly rebuilt, making it far more beautiful and commodious than it was before. It was a large, elegant, comfortable home, and Stowe says it was perfectly suited for the entertainment of any prince. On the 10th of June 1509, the eve of his wedding day, King Henry VIII would bestow this very modern, comfortable and fashionable new house on his new bride, Catherine of Aragon, as a wedding present. The house was to be entirely her domain, her private space, a place for her to retire from the rigours of court life at Westminster. Not that court life in Westminster would last long anyway. The privy apartments there were burnt down in 1512, and new arrangements had to be made by the king. In 1515, King Henry VIII would buy from Cardinal Wolsey a plot of land on the other side of Blackfriars from Baynard's Castle, and there he would construct a new palace called the Palace of Bridewell, which until he acquired Whitehall 15 years later would be the king's primary London residence. No doubt the closeness of this plot to Baynard's Castle and to his wife was part of the appeal of Bridewell. And so this stretch of the Thames, right in the heart of the City of London, would become the centre of English court life for the next 15 years, with the young king and queen living in his and hers palaces on either side of the Blackfriars precinct. The Blackfriars sandwiched between these two palaces would also prove during this period to be the political heart of the country. Within the precinct was a 100-foot-long hall which Henry VIII used to house Parliament, and Parliament sat there in 1523 and 1529. In June of 1529, when her marriage to Henry had gone sour and he was wishing to be rid of her, poor Catherine of Aragon would appear before the legatine court in the Parliament chamber at Blackfriars, right next door to Baynard's castle, her residence. In the late summer of 1531, the king banished Catherine from court and from London, and she lost the use of Baynard's castle. Baynard's castle then appears to have been unused for the next 3 years, with all of Catherine's household goods and fine furnishings still within it. Although happy to banish the woman he now called the Dowager Princess of Wales from London, Henry couldn't quite bring himself to disperse or repurpose her possessions. It was only in February of 1535 that he got round to doing something, probably at the insistence of Anne Boleyn. Her vice-chamberlain, Sir Edward Baynton, was dispatched to survey the wardrobe, the household goods that Catherine had left behind at Baynard's castle. It is possible that Anne intended to live there herself, but there is no firm evidence that she ever did so. But the inventory survives, and it indicates just how lavishly this building was furnished for Queen Catherine's use. There are hangings embroidered with the arms of England and Spain, celebrating the marriage of Henry and Catherine. There were numerous tapestries, including 6 with the story of Jason, 4 with the story of Hercules, 3 depicting the old law of the Old Testament and the new law of the New. There was a rich canopy, striped or paned with cloth of gold, and embroidered to go over the Queen's chair, and a cloth of estate to go behind it, made of crimson cloth of gold, embroidered with the arms of England and Spain. The Queen's beds, their bolsters, pillows, sheets, and cushions were all enumerated. In the Queen's closet, her private chapel, were 3 tables, i.e. altarpieces. The first was a large altarpiece with leaves showing the 3 Magi kneeling before Christ. A second showed Our Lady of Pity. The third was a depiction of a queen kneeling before the Virgin Mary and St. Elizabeth. Perhaps this once belonged to an English queen, maybe even Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's consort. After the inventory was made, it was perused by both the King and Queen Anne, and a note was made in the margin of which of these goods they both wanted. There was a cup of horn with a cover garnished with antique work, and the inventory notes that this and 2 needleworking stools covered in velvet and decorated with silver were to be delivered to the Queen's Grace, i.e. to Anne Boleyn. There were 2 chessboards of ivory with chessmen of the same that were delivered directly to the King. Catherine had left behind at Baynard's castle some of her clothing, including 7 pairs of slippers of the Spanish fashion, garnished with gold. But the most poignant items in this long list of fine objects and textiles were the necessaries, the clothes of fine holland worked with gold that Catherine wore during her various confinements in childbed. They were kept by her long after there was any hope of further children for her and the king. But rather chillingly, there is a note in the margin that these were to be delivered to Anne Boleyn, presumably for her own use. Baynard's castle appears to have been used as a residence by Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard during their brief time as queens in 1540 and 1541, after which the property was let to various courtiers. Sir William Sidney, the tutor to the future Edward VI, was living there in 1548 when he made his will. By 1551, the castle was then in the hands of William Herbert, the first Earl of Pembroke. His wife, Anne Parr, the sister of Henry VIII's last queen, Catherine Parr, died there in 1552. Now, the house, as reconstructed by Henry VII, was ranged around a single courtyard, and it is thought that in the 1550s Pembroke greatly altered and extended the house, creating a second courtyard to the west of Henry VII's structure. There is some visual evidence and drawings and engravings of the house, both before and after Pembroke's additions. The earliest depiction we have is from 1543 and is part of Anton van der Vingaard's Panorama of London. It is the clearest impression we have of the house and its appearance as it was in Queen Catherine's time. It is shown as a substantial block of 2 stories with attics, with the south front facing the river, with 2 octagonal towers framing this facade, the one to the west being somewhat larger and taller, and what appears to be a series of 4 bay windows along the front between these towers, with stairs rising from the water to this south front. Later engravings show the house as altered by Pembroke, with the addition of a courtyard to the west of the earlier structure. Holler's engravings are perhaps the most reliable, particularly his view of the house from the south from his 1647 long view of London. What he depicts is entirely consistent with Wingard. He shows a 2-storey house with attics above, the same configuration of octagonal towers and bay windows on the south front. He indicates too that the house is as deep as it is wide, and that there was a matching octagonal tower at the end of what was an east facade. He also shows Pembroke's new western court. The facade facing the river of this structure is once again 2-storey with bay windows, and it terminates close to the precinct of the old Blackfriars with a circular tower topped with an onion dome. Holler depicts the stairs that gave access to the main block of the house in some detail. He shows a pontoon of 2 or is it 3 arches projecting into the Thames. The woodcut or Agas map of London from the early 1560s, engraved a decade or so after Pembroke had added his court, more or less depicts the buildings as Holler has them a century later, except that there is a second set of stairs and a landing place opening into a much more prominent entrance in the south front of Pembroke's new court. It is curious that this is shown and is not evident in Holler's more detailed depiction, but then you do have to take the depictions in this map with a pinch of salt. Baynard's castle remained in the hands of the Herbert family until 1650 and the death of the 4th Earl of Pembroke, and it was primarily used as a residence by his wife, Lady Anne Clifford. She said in her memoirs that the house was full of riches and that it was much more secure with her living there. Goodness knows what treasures it contained. Perhaps many of the furnishings Catherine of Aragon had known were still there. The house was still part of the Crown estate, and in 1660, at the Restoration, it was granted to Francis Talbot, the 11th Earl of Shrewsbury. The Shrewsbury's tenancy of the house wouldn't last very long. Baynard's castle was gutted in 1666 in the Great Fire of London. We know from Wenceslas Holler's prospect of the city after the fire that it was still standing right up to parapet level, but the rich contents, including no doubt many Tudor treasures, were all lost in the blaze. By 1676, most of the remains of Baynard's castle had been cleared away to make way for wharves and landing places for London's burgeoning trade. Some scant remains of the palace would survive until the 19th century. The base of the corner tower of the Earl of Pembroke's block on the riverfront appeared on Ogleby and Morgan's map of 1676. This could still be seen in 1852, forming part of the riverfront. Apparently 2 of the towers of the structure facing north were still standing in the 19th century, built into the houses that fronted onto Thames Street, but were demolished with them in the 19th century to make way for the works of the Carron Iron Company. The foundations of the house still exist, although they are now landlocked as the bank of the Thames at this point was pushed outwards in the 19th century, and some were rediscovered in the 1970s excavations. But like many excavations of London's archaeology, they are yet to be written up adequately. In addition to the 1970s Baynard House, the memory of this great house, once an opulent royal palace that witnessed so much of the rich history of London, is still preserved in the name of the City of London ward, Castle Baynard Ward. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.